Hello, welcome to all you people coming in. I think we're up to 49 attendees already. So if you've joined us today, what I would love you to do is that we're getting a longer attendees list. The first thing I'd love you to do is where your name is, can you rename yourself? What I'd like to see is your first name, so I know Alice, Ben, Brandon, and then at the university that you're at. Because it's really lovely to see where people are coming from. So if you don't know how to do this, go to your name in the sidebar, the panelist list. I think you can click on your name and then rename yourselves. If you can't do that, let me know, but hopefully you can. Then the other thing I'd love to do is in the chat, you can change the chat settings so you can message everyone. I would love it to answer what made you embrace online research. And the reason I'm asking you to do this is because we're going to use this chat later. So I want to make sure you're all set up using the chat properly. So change it from all panelists to messaging everyone or all panelists and attendee. And then you can say, what made you get into online research? So I wanted to get huge samples for my research. There aren't the opportunities to change your name. That's a shame. Thank you, Rebecca, for letting me know. Recruit more representation and larger samples. I wanted to get huge samples. That's my one. More people. There's like 79 of you online. COVID. Lots of people saying COVID. Yes, COVID has been quite a thing, getting us all out of our labs and online, which is painful. I had to because of the pandemic. I'd like to test autistic participants. So for you, it was really about reaching a niche audience. And so I wanted to recruit people with rare conditions, faster participant recruitment. Excellent. Yes, the speed of online research is just extraordinary, isn't it? From taking a month to get 100 respondents to being able to get 400 respondents in an hour by using Prolific or something else. I just think that's just such a gain for online research, and it makes us have far more confidence in our results. Being able to carry out my experiments during the pandemic, yes, absolutely. I know our panel have been running research and probably felt grateful that they were already up and running before the pandemic hit and didn't have to panic. Increased samples. Deaf participants are difficult to reach. Yes, I can imagine they are. Difficult to get them to come into the lab. Great, thank you for that. And then okay, a question that I'm really curious about at the moment is when you guys can get back to the lab, do you think you'll continue doing online research, or do you think you'll go back to all day online? So type in like online if you'll continue with online, lab only if you think you'll do lab only, or both if you think you'll continue to use a mixture. I think I'd be in the both camp. That I think both is just great because you get the precision in the lab, don't you? And the pandemic was the push I needed. Yes, you've been putting it off. Yes, that's so much the experience. I resonate with that because it's hard. It's hard changing what we've done before. All right. So now, final question. Now that you're all in the spirit of this, what challenges to research do you face that you're hoping to learn about today? Because our panelists are going to be reading your responses, and they're going to read all of these responses. And then if they've got insights for you that are going to answer your questions, they're going to be able to pick them up in their talk. So what challenges to research do you face that you're hoping to learn about today? Collecting high quality speech recordings remotely, figuring out if the timing is good enough, screening participants before experiments, experimental variables, children in collecting high quality speech recordings, just how to set it up generally, concerned that participants are not hearing the auditory stimuli. I'm sorry if I'm skipping over these, but like the panel, while I am saying some of the next bits, the panel will no doubt read those in detail, and we'll definitely try and pick up with these earlier. But this is fantastic. I think it's really given me a lot of context about the struggles you're facing and what you want to know about. So a little bit about me. I'm Jo Evershed. I'm the founder and CEO of Gorilla Experiment Builder, and I'm your host today. I've been helping researchers take their studies online since 2012, so nearly 9 years ago. So I'm an old hand at this stuff. Auditory research was not right at the beginning, but I think Kyle's been doing it for quite a few years now, and he's one of our panelists. So for the last 2 years, we've also brought researchers together for our online summer conference, Beyond Online. It's behavioral research, which is like short for behavioral science online, where pioneering researchers from all over the world share insights into online methods. And I think Rachel spoke at our Be Online conference in 2020. So papers, of course, have their place for recording what's done, but unfortunately, papers are rarely a playbook for how to run research successfully. And so that's why we run a methods conference. Don't miss it. If you want to hear from a whole load of pioneering researchers who sharing their methods of exactly how they got the successes they have, come and join our Be Online conference. And I can give you a link here of how to find the videos from last year, where I think both Kyle and Rachel spoke actually, and also lots of other research as well. But we can't wait a whole year to share methodological best practices and all the methodological advances. So we're now convening monthly Gorilla Presents to help researchers taking studies online so that you can learn from the best. So I've got a little poll to do. I know, I think Josh is going to set it up. We've got a poll. What would be really helpful for our panelists, one last thing, is to find out what level of a Gorilla user are you from. You've never touched it before. You've got an account but haven't built anything. Played with the task questionnaire builder. I've put an experiment online, or I've run lots of experiments online. I'm a pro. Now, while you're answering that, today's webinar is all about online auditory and speech research. And we know from listening to our users that auditory and speech research is very popular among Gorilla users because it's so hard to do in other tools, and so it's so nice to have an interface that's really easy, and then you can reach all of these diverse samples. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to bring together this vibrant community, discuss the highs and lows of moving auditory and speech research out of the lab. If you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A. You've already done that so that the panelists can answer them. Oh yeah, so separate from the chat, there is a Q&A panel as well. So if you click on Q&A, you can actually write a very specific question in there, and then the panelists will read those, and we'll try and make sure we answer them as we go. Now, to our panelists. Here, with the help of our experts, we're going to discuss what worked, what was challenging, and what we still need to do in order to do what we still need in order to do top quality auditory and speech research online. So please welcome Rachel Theodore from the University of Connecticut, Alice Milne from UCL, Jasmin from Birkbeck, and Kim Dahl from the University of Boston. And I will let them each introduce themselves, starting with Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Theodore, Associate Professor at University of Connecticut. My research examines how listeners map the acoustic speech signal to meaning, with a particular focus on the early stages of this process in which listeners extract individual consonants and vowels from the acoustic speech stream. Our primary questions in this domain concern listeners' ability to dynamically modify or adapt the mapping to speech sounds given exposure to structured phonetic variation.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. How about you, Alice? What do you research?
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm based at UCL in the Ear Institute, and I'm part of Maria Tate's lab. And we've been doing a lot of research using tones, particularly sequences of tones, looking at how we use patterns in those sequences to process those sounds in different ways. And we've been working with Gorilla sort of since the pandemic started, and have learned some important lessons in that time.
Thank you, Alice. Kyle, how about you? Oh, you're muted.
It's great to be unmuted and to be here. Thanks, Joe. I'm Kyle Jasmin. I'm a research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, based in the Alpha Lab with Professor Fred Dick and Adam Tierney. And lately, I've been researching speech perception strategies in different populations. So how different individuals rely on different kinds of acoustic cues in order to perceive speech. And so I've done a variety of different, primarily speech perception studies meant to tease this out. And most of them have been done in Gorilla.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Kim, finally.
Hi there. I'm Kim. I'm a doctoral student at the STEP lab at Boston University. And I research voice perception, specifically how we use voice to perceive others' gender. And more recently, how expert clinicians perceive voice, given variations in audio quality, which is particularly helpful for the current telepractice conditions.
Yes, that of course that makes sense. So now to that, thank you so much for introducing yourself. I'm just trying to keep an eye on my timings at the same time, which is a bit of a mistake. What we're going to do now is go to Rachel to tell us more about your research in depth. If you take about 5 minutes, that will probably be spot on.
Great. So I will tell you about a range of tasks that we've been able to implement with Gorilla. A more careful walkthrough of some of this is in a document that I prepared that I've just dropped into the chat. I will say at this point that I've yet to find a task that I want to run on Gorilla that I can't. And I've yet to find a kind of behavioral phenomenon that I've wanted to replicate in web-based testing and haven't been able to do that. I do think our lab is currently maybe pushing that frontier. We're trying to replicate a left ear, right hemisphere advantage in a dichotic listening task. And this really may be pushing the limits of what we can do in a web-based format. But our past success with Gorilla has been what's given us the kind of gumption to even try that. So to give you an idea of some of these tasks, I'm actually going to share my screen and refer to, can you see the slide that says now categorical perception? Is that one being viewed? Good, okay. Yeah. Just to give you an idea of some of the tasks that we've used, many of which require assessing listeners' psychometric functions. So for example, whether they hear one of two speech sounds given a range of acoustic phonetic variation. And what I've shown here, I'm just going to go through really briefly some successes in terms of the types of tasks we've had. Being able to replicate standard findings of categorical perception and also distributional learning, we've done with ease. To anyone who's looked at a psychometric function before, these look really nice. And the fact that the two functions in each of these plot are displaced in line with a manipulation we had is evidence of replicating distributional learning. Other phenomena we've been able to replicate are influences of lexical knowledge on phonetic categorization. So if you hear a potentially ambiguous phonetic variant or some aspect of the acoustics in speech, we as listeners tend to process that in terms of the category that makes sense with our word knowledge about a language. So if you have an ambiguity in a gis-kiss context, you're likely to perceive it as kiss. But if that same, say, acoustic ambiguity is presented in a gift-kiff context, you're more likely to perceive it as gift. And we've been able to replicate that online. The psychometric functions we see at the individual level are incredibly stable. This has been one of our kind of perpetual questions as we go to web-based testing, is always how do you pull out the people who are doing your task, but maybe not doing it like everyone else, versus the people who aren't doing your task and are just pressing buttons randomly. And I haven't filtered the individual functions you're seeing here. And this level of variability really maps with what we observe in the same task in our in-lab participants. One other success we've had concerns replicating a phenomenon called lexically guided perceptual learning. And this was one that was exciting for us because the key acoustic manipulation here is a spectral difference, so a difference for our contrast in high frequency regions. So it's a potential point of concern because, a fundamental problem in web-based testing is control over the listening environment. And our particular parameter of interest was, a relatively low amplitude, high frequency sound. But the displacement you see in group level functions here was our evidence that this particular paradigm could track online. Other tasks that we've replicated include adaptation to noise vocoded speech, which is a digital signal manipulation that is often used to mimic the input through a cochlear implant. And this, we took use of Gorilla and some tools in Prolific to be able to test people a week apart, and in between those two tests, provide some exposure to noise vocoded speech. And what you can see here is evidence of learning over time. And here we used a transcription task in addition. So this was a new thing for us in terms of phonetic categorization. More recently, we've moved into reaction time measures. I will say that if you take a look at that longer document I dropped in the chat, you'll see that our lab has taken what I think could be best described as a rabidly obsessive approach to web-based data collection, in that we have done a lot of internal tests, internal replication of our own in-lab studies, really kind of to make ourselves reviewer number two, and really, kind of meet our own threshold for high data quality in these tasks. And this has been very true with our foray into reaction time measures. The good news is that we have been able to replicate, on the, within 20 milliseconds, mean effects that we get online versus in the lab. I think I'm approaching 5 minutes. I'll just say, in terms of reaction time measures, we've replicated talker normalization effects. So previous research has documented that listeners are faster in identifying words produced by a single talker than words produced by mixed talkers in a given block. But also talker familiarity effects in terms of reaction time. So if you have experience with a talker's voice, you process their speech faster than if you don't. I'm sure we'll kind of come up to tips and tricks and so on, but I will say, in terms of these reaction time measures, one thing that we found that's been decreasing our variability to a bit is giving people in Gorilla, let me pull this up, actually just a really easy image of what we want their hands to be during the task. This is something that we do in the lab, where we have a button box that has clear labels and an experiment standing over their shoulder, making sure that at least at the onset, their hands are placed, and being able to embed this in the instruction screen and even keeping it on the screen. We've seen, as expected, reaction times get faster, and they actually get less variable with just this little tweak there. So I will cede the floor now. Thank you.
Rachel, that is brilliant. What a great top tip. Attendees, if you thought that was a top tip about showing the picture where the hands are, can you put TT in the chat, just so that Rachel knows that you really appreciate what she shared with you there? Because it's really difficult for us panelists. We can't see you, we don't get applause, we don't hear the like amazing. Yeah, there you go, look at that, Rachel. TT, top tip from Rachel there. Now next, Alice, same deal for you. Can you tell us a bit about what you've done, your successes, what you're proud of? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to also say that is a great tip that I will be implementing when I start my next study. I also just have a few slides, and to say this is based on some work that I've been doing, but also, as I said in the introduction, work in the lab. So we've tested thousands of people, although I realize that's not that big a number now for online work. So these people in the lab have been doing that. So this is their collective wisdom that I am sharing with you. And we've done a lot of experiments using sequences of tones. And so the type of experiments I've been doing will play a sequence of tones. There's short tones, just 50 milliseconds, put into a sequence of maybe 5 or 6 seconds. And I get people to press the spacebar when they notice a gap in that sequence. And I'm looking at what does, if the pattern is predictive, do they press more often? Are they better at detecting that gap than if the sequence is completely random? And my colleagues have been doing similar studies looking at reaction times. If you play people the same pattern again, even though they don't realize they've heard it before, they tend to get faster. So this is the type of work that's been done in this lab with Maria Tate. and colleagues. I've more got now sort of my top tips, I guess, rather than more on what I've been doing. The first thing that we learned we had to implement was a browser autoplay check. I know Gorilla's got a bit of documentation on this on the website, but we found that with certain browsers, people, if you do an auto-playing of a sound rather than pressing a button to start the sound, sometimes it won't play. And that's because the browsers have blocked ad poppers and things like that. So you have to automatically enable it. So we just do this really easily. It's just this screen preparing them. There's going to be a sound on the next page. They hear a nice, it's sort of a jazz piano riff. And then they have to press yes, and that will take them onto the experiment. If they press no, we have an instruction screen telling them how to change their settings. We limit it to Chrome, which is why we've only got the autoplay settings here for Chrome. And we've generally not had too many problems with that since implementing this. The second thing that we strongly advocate for is a headphone check. I know there's a question in the chat about sort of headphone quality, sound quality. We did some work in the summer. Again, there was a team of us that worked really collaboratively together to put together a new type of headphone screening. It's based on something called the Huggins pitch, where you hear this white noise, and if you're wearing headphones, you should be able to hear a sort of tone emerge from that white noise. It's on Gorilla. It's called Efficient Headphone Screen. If you downloaded it a few months ago, we've redone this screen so it's all a lot clearer because there was a lot of information on there, so it might look a bit different to how you've seen it before. And we've got all the details of that in the paper, where we tested this online with people that we trusted and got them to do it using speakers or using headphones, and then tested how good the test was at detecting if they were actually using headphones and how many could pass it with speakers. So that's all there, and we would advocate using one for a number of reasons. You can control that sound a bit better. You can also identify any issues with their auditory equipment. So I know Rachel, I think, mentioned that they were going to do some dichotic presentations of stimuli. One thing we've learned is that so many devices do not play sounds in stereo, and it's a really big problem. So it can also help to identify issues like that. You've got more control over the participants' environment, so they will probably not be able to pass the headphone test if they're in a really noisy background environment. And it also does somewhat, it will help block out some of that background noise as well, having that physical earbud or headphone on. It's quite a nice check, not to do with audio processing really, just that people are following instructions and can do that. Kick them out early if they can't. And you can also use multiple headphone checks together. So we talk about that in the paper. There's two other ones. One that uses the Woods one, which has been around for a few years now, and a binaural beats one that uses a slightly different mechanism of testing. So you do get some people who can pass the one that we've got there with speakers. If you do an additional test, you'll get that down to even fewer, but obviously at the cost of you're going to reject some more people that are actually using headphones, and it takes a bit longer. I think, there's a few more points I had. We're doing sounds in the lab. We are so careful to make sure that participants are protected from high noise levels. So, online, we have that same responsibility. So make sure that you've got calibration screens and you've got points where you're warning them about this. And for the autoplay sounds that start, make sure you're using the web audio function on Gorilla. We restrict to Chrome and ask them to use Windows. You also do have to deal with the fact that sometimes your sounds will drop out, they won't load. It's just, that is the nature of online testing. It might be a server issue, it might be a connection issue, it might just be a hardware issue. So it's mitigating for that, making sure that you're checking your spreadsheets. You can ask the participants, but generally they're pretty rubbish at reporting if they drop out. But you can look at their patterns of performance, because often, a bit like looking at those thresholds, you can see if people haven't been playing sounds, it becomes quite clear. Catch trials, these are again general things for online testing. My catch trials are just really simple. So I said they're looking out for a gap, or rather than having a complex pattern, I just have a very simple sound, and anyone would notice the gap in that. If they're failing that, that means they're not paying proper attention or they can't hear my sounds. And finally, just appropriate motivation. Again, this goes for a lot of online studies. My colleague Roberta recently did a speech and noise study showing how the outcome changes when you reward them more. They start to look more like they do in the lab. So that's how we motivated them more. And Roberta's also been doing some longer experiments, so getting to sort of 40 minutes an hour. So she's someone to contact if you want information on that type of thing. And I'm sure I'm past my time now, so I will pass back to everyone.
Alice, that was absolutely brilliant. So many tips. So attendees, let Alice know which was your favorite top tip. Was it autoplay, what she said about headphones, what she said about participant screening, or what she said about safety? What for you was the big takeaway that you're going to take away today and take back to your labs, and that you know is going to improve your research? Look at that, the headphone check. Everybody's loving the alternative headphone checks. Thank you so much for sharing that, Alice. Now, Kyle, over to you. 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Joe. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've done online lately. So mainly I've been working on perceptual cue weighting. So measuring the extent to which individuals rely on different acoustic dimensions in order to understand speech. And the way that online testing has been most useful is in enabling access to people who would be otherwise difficult to reach. So even before the pandemic struck, I was working on a study on individuals with congenital amusia. So these are people who are from birth struggle with perceiving and remembering sequences of pitches, and so this manifests in different perception of music, and what we've shown is differential perception of speech. And so we ran a pretty intensive MRI study where we had to recruit people with amusia from all over the UK and pay for their travel to come into the lab. And then we realized that there was one more experiment we should have run with them. And of course, by this point, it was impossible to bring them back in. And these people were also older people. Some of them were 60 and 70 years old and were not inclined to come back to the lab. And luckily, we were able to run this follow-up study online, which ended up being the most important experiment in the paper. And so that's just one example. We've done a number of perceptual cue weighting studies that have now been published. For example, in people who speak different languages. So we've shown that people whose first language is Mandarin Chinese tend to rely more on pitch in order to understand speech than they do on other dimensions such as duration. And we've been able to test Mandarin speakers in China, and as well as Mandarin speakers in London during the pandemic. So people who we wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise. In terms of methods, I gave a short talk for the Be Online conference where I talked about the robustness of the auditory data we've been able to collect online with Gorilla. And what we've shown is that it does tend to replicate with data that we've collected in the lab, and we've been able to use this to respond to reviewers. So it was very helpful that we had some data sets that we collected both in lab and online. We've done split half reliability measures and found that online data tends to have high reliability. We've shown that in lab and online measures tend to correlate in ways that they should correlate. So we've shown that, for example, people who weight pitch more strongly when they're understanding speech tend to have finer pitch detection thresholds measured in the lab under quiet conditions. So I feel like we have a lot of reasons at this point to believe that online auditory testing is valid and is replicable and should be used whenever it's appropriate. In terms of tips, I agree with pretty much everything that the other panelists have pointed out. In terms of headphones, in my own experience, I think most people do have headphones, but in comparing people who've used headphones and people who haven't, just on sort of a small scale, I found that for the kinds of tests that I personally use, speech perception with pretty obvious large cues, it doesn't seem to matter if people are using headphones, in my experience. But of course, your mileage may vary, and it really depends on the task. And I think that's all I have to point out. I've seen some of the questions that have been coming in, and so I think maybe I'll leave time for
those. That's
to answer
brilliant.
some of those.
Kyle, that was fantastic. One of the things I find I love hearing, because you got to do some of this before we went online, before like all the behavioral scientists went online. It's so reassuring to hear that you've managed to run some of these things in the lab and online at the same time. So again, attendees, I want you to write either inspired, if you're inspired by the idea of testing different groups like the Mandarin Chinese in China versus in England, or whether what you really liked hearing from Kyle was about the safety of knowing that this stuff does replicate from the lab online. So are you inspired, or do you feel safe? That's what I want from you here. Brilliant. So we've got some inspired, we've got some safe, we've got both. Excellent. So thank you for that. I think you've added a lot of value to people listening here today. And now finally, Kim, how about you? I'm really looking forward to hearing about your research.
Well, I'm happy to be here to provide a little bit of a different perspective as a very early career researcher. So I'm in my PhD program and was forced to do research online because of the pandemic. And I'll tell you a little bit about my research because it is very, very straightforward and very easily transferred to an online format. And so for anybody in the audience who is hearing some of these other amazing studies that are being done and thinking, okay, that's more complex than what I'm doing, I want to give you an example of something just very straightforward, and that worked out really well. So typically the questions that we're asking are, what factors affect how listeners perceive the voices of others? And specifically, I'm interested in how the acoustic characteristics of someone's voice affects how others perceive their gender. And how a listener's characteristics, their own gender, their social networks, their age, how that affects how they perceive other people's gender based on their voice. And then more recently, we've been looking at how an expert clinician can successfully evaluate people's voices when it's transmitted online. Because of course, the pandemic shifted a lot of voice care to telepractice, and we've been wondering, okay, how reliable are these assessments that are forming the basis of diagnosis and treatment planning? And so basically for these kind of studies, what we would typically do in the lab is we'd bring someone in and we'd sit them in front of the computer with some headphones and we'd play them some voice samples. And then they would classify the voice, characterize the voice, rate it on some scales. And so you can see that that's very straightforward, easy to create in Gorilla, easy to run online. And so we did that, but one thing that we did differently than what I think a lot of researchers are using Gorilla and other online platforms, we were still looking at small sample sizes, and we wanted to maintain a little bit of control over the sessions. So we ran our sessions concurrently through Gorilla and in Zoom. So we met with our participants, we walked them through the study, we did the consent, and then we stayed in the Zoom call with them with cameras and microphones off while they went on and did the study in Gorilla. And one of the reasons that we wanted to do that for our first study is we were looking at clinician evaluations of voice, and it was quite challenging, you can imagine, to recruit busy laryngologists and speech pathologists to sit with us for 2.5 hours to do the study. And so recruitment was a real challenge. And once we had someone who agreed to do this with us, we didn't want to lose them because of some small question or tech issue that we could have helped them with. So we stayed in the Zoom call, so that way if they hit a bump along the way, they came back and let us know, we figured it out, and they moved on with the study. So if that is a concern of yours, to sort of see the control of letting your study be out and available and have people accessing it and doing it on their own, if you're worried about the jeopardy of losing valuable participants, that was an option that worked out really well for us. And I will second many of the tips, specifically when we were setting up our studies, watching the Be Online videos, Rachel's, and Kyle's was really helpful. And we are using Alice's headphone screening, which has helped make sure that we're controlling that environment and making sure that the audio is transmitting the way we intend it. And one other thing I'll add is that we wanted to make sure, because we were assessing how audio quality was influencing clinicians' assessments, we wanted to make sure that our files were not being altered in any way when it was being transmitted through Gorilla. So we actually did a little bit of an assessment and recorded all of those transmissions through Gorilla to see if there were any changes from the original samples and what was transmitted through Gorilla. And we were pleased to find that there weren't changes. So for anybody concerned about that, we, at least in our little quick little check on that, ruled that out as a possible issue.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so glad that worked out for you. For everybody watching today, if you thought that Zoom tip for running your either a small safety sample or just because you don't want to leave participants, if you thought that was genius, type Zoom into the chat now so that Kim knows that that was just such an awesome tip. Yes, Zoom piling in here. Everyone's really excited by that tip. I'm going to add that to our like maybe write a blog about it or something to say this is a great idea. You probably know I'm going to share your talk where you share that idea. That's a much better idea. Right, now we've time to come to the Q&A session. I think we've got 7 questions. Can you guys open the questions? I think you probably can because you're panelists. And if you want to, let's start at the top. Any recommendations for synchronizing auditory and visual stimuli? We found that hard online. Yes, I think it's very hard. Have any of you guys done that? No.
I mean, for the level of precision we need for that, just putting your visual stimulus and auditory stimulus on the same display in Gorilla, which gives the perception of a sound, and at least at that level they are perceived instantaneous. That's the only level of control our lab has needed at this point.
Right. I think Josh, who's one of my Gorilla team, has got an answer. Josh, do you want to unmute yourself and give your answer? You can put your video on as well.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so this comes up quite a bit as well on the consultancy desk, and in general, our recommendation is, if you really want to make sure the two things are perfectly fused, is to turn it into a video. So overlay your audio onto the picture, make it one file, and that way when you play that file, you know the two things are always going to be synchronized. I think that's definitely our best recommendation. If there's some reason you can't do that, then send us a ticket to the support desk, because I do believe one of our developers has a couple extra code tricks that can help. But like I say, the best recommendation here is just to fuse them together in a video.
And just so that everybody listening understands, appreciates what's going on. So we're limited with Gorilla by what's available in the browser, right? There are things that we'd love to make possible that we just can't because we're limited by the browser. We're limited by what Chrome or Safari or Edge can do. And browsers are really good at synchronizing visual stimuli because historically they've mostly been used for visually stimuli, web pages, etc. And sound they haven't needed that much fidelity. So a lot of what has pushed web browsers on is what's needed in online games. And as people have pushed what they need in online games forward, but if you play a lot of video games, you just have a continual sound landscape playing in the background, and then visual effects happening in front of you, but they don't need to be tightly synchronized. So that's what we're limited by here. Now there are tips and tricks, and our team is constantly digging into what's possible and improving the bounds of it. But what we found, and what Rachel's found, I think, and Carl, is that oftentimes there are other ways of approaching the question which gets around the limitations of the browser by design. So you have to just be a little bit creative in what you're trying to do. That's often a good strategy. Right, question number 2 from Brandon Merritt. For an auditory free classification task, participants will need to click boxes. Right, does anybody want to speak to that one? I think this is about dragging and dropping boxes. We don't have drag and drop in the task builder at the moment. I think it's coming soon in the game builder, which is coming out later this year, and probably in task builder 2. But the way I would get around that functionally at the moment is to have the boxes that people can play, and so they can listen to the sounds, and then separately do a rank widget somewhere, and then they drag those bits. But you don't have to have the two things together. Does that make sense? Hope that does. Okay, question number 3. Simone Sprenger, I would like to do a picture word interference studies with children using spoken distractors. That requires accurate timing of pictures and distractors, as well as the measurement of timing of spoken responses. Any thoughts?
I haven't done anything with this. Oh yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Oh no, I was just going to say I think this is a good candidate for what Josh is recommending. Which is to use a video if you're really concerned about timing and synchronization between auditory and visual stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good tip. Now, Velia Cardin, do you have any recommendations of the best way to pay participants if you don't recruit via Prolific or MTurk? Novel payment strategies. Kim, how did you pay your Zoom people?
Yeah, nothing terribly novel. We ended up keeping a lot of our typical procedures very much the same, so consent and payment. So rather than handing them the payment form, I showed it on the screen and they told me what to mark, and then they get mailed a check. So the specifics of how that might work might depend on your requirements of your institution in terms of mailing checks, but we kind of went old-fashioned with it.
Yeah. I think other tips I've heard is using Amazon gift cards. They're a bit easier to send by email. I think you can do the same with like Apple Pay gift cards, which some people like. So I think those are other ways you can do things which are easy. I've been using Pavlovia, and one of the issues I've had is to assign lists. I often have 8 different lists, so doing different experiments would be cumbersome. With random assignment, things seems never even out. Can I in Gorilla check how often each list has already been run to assign the list for a new participant? So this is more like a counterbalancing thing. I think the way you do it in Gorilla, if you wanted absolutely dead on even lists, is you take a task. Each task would have a separate stimuli set, and then you'd randomize exactly the right number of participants to each stimuli set, and you can set a quota limit at the end of each list if that's what you're after. So I think that's possible, but then it's not random assignment. And I think if you do want random assignment, then there's a little bit of noise and you don't get a perfect end balance. Like that's the trade-off. Anything
here? Yeah, here's our workaround. So what we'll do there, because we do this all the time. So we'll set up the randomizer. Say the ultimate goal is we want 40 people in each of 8 lists. What we'll do is run in batches. So we might set it for the first run to put 10 people in each list. And, then you might have some people that drop out or didn't pass your headphone screen or just press 1 buttons. And then we'll do the next run. So you're able to determine the final number on the list. So then the next run, we'll set the node numbers to be different. So we might not send 10 down each one and so on. And to be honest, you could probably set it really high, say 30 people for each, and then maybe just do a second run to kind of even out the cells. But yes, in Gorilla, you can. It's implemented in the version control. So you'd have one version of your experiment and then open it up, change the counts in the randomizer nodes, commit it to a second version, and run that.
Yeah, that's a great tip, Rachel. I really like the idea of doing a first batch and then doing a second batch. If everybody else liked that tip, TT, top tip in the chat, please. One of the things we're considering bringing out is an allocator node, which keeps track of attrition. So it allocates participants to groups. And then if you lose them by their attrition, obviously that it would resupply it. So you end up with exactly equal groups. Obviously that doesn't give you anything about data quality. And so there's always sometimes a second check you need to do if you've got one group which is giving you worse data quality. But if you like that idea of an allocator node rather than a randomizer node, go to our roadmap, suggest it, upvote it if it's already there. These are things that we could allocate a node would be brilliant, says Sarah. I recognize Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Okay.
Just to releasing in batches is also a really good idea just in general. There's nothing like running 20 people and then there being a problem. We sort of tend to, but I think it's the general advice to release in small batches.
It is really good advice, definitely. Kaja has asked, does anyone here do experiments within the EU? Gorilla servers are inside the EU. You shouldn't have any problem using Gorilla if you're in the EU. So that one's a good one. Has anyone been able to collect production data online? Oh, that was no, that one's gone. has anyone mixed sounds online? Kyle, you've mixed sounds. I don't know if you've done them dynamically to vary the signal tone. What did you do?
So I didn't end up doing it online dynamically. So I did use a Java library called I think it was tone.js for generating sounds dynamically online. And it worked fine in Google Chrome, and I was able to like adjust the parameters of different pitches and adjust the amplitude and amplitude modulation rate and that kind of thing with sliders, and that all worked fine. And if anyone is curious about you know, how to do that or what some example code looks like, feel free to get in touch. But you know, in general, if I can generate the stimuli upfront in MATLAB and I know exactly what they are and then put them online, that seems to work better for me. So unless there's a really good reason to generate them dynamically, my preference would be to just create them beforehand and upload them to Gorilla.
Yeah, I think that would be my preference too. You just have that bit more control, and yes, you have to do a bit more work creating all of the stimuli up front, but I think unless you're, and even if you're dynamically staircasing, you can still have pre-created all of the levels, right? And then serve the file you need. It just gives you that greater assurance, and this takes one more bit of movement, one more bit of risk out of your experiment, which I think is really
absolutely great. And actually, the reason I ended up going with the pre-recorded was because the developers of this library made one minor update and it broke the whole experiment. So then you have to be sure you're archiving the version that you need to run the experiment. But then who knows if that will stay, you know, compatible with browsers, you know, in 2-3 years even.
Yeah. There's another question here for you, Carl, while you're here. From Jiang Gao, which is, among the multiple cues you've been testing, could there have been some cues that are more affected by other cues? So audio device, participants' engagement, something?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I can speak to that a bit. So, so one of the things we've been looking at is which cues are more salient or attention grabbing. We found that, for example, people who speak Mandarin find changes in pitch cues and even in English speech more attention grabbing. So there will be differences between individuals and across populations. But for most of the studies I've been running, the crucial comparison is within individuals between two cues. And so, so just going back to the question. So unless there's some kind of systematic, you know, confound wherever, you know, you're looking at two groups and one group is only using headphones and one group is only using speakers or something like that, that could be a major problem. But as long as you're logging the kind of equipment that people are using and it's relatively balanced across groups, then and your comparisons are you know, within subject, then I think it shouldn't be a problem. But sure, in principle, I don't. It seems that, you know, different audio configurations might affect cues differentially, but there are ways to design your experiment to mitigate anything adverse coming from that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Kyle. There's been a question here about production data, which I know none of you have collected speech production data, but Vivian Rogers, you've kindly answered. Do you want to jump on and share with people what you've been doing with speech production? Is that able to? Maybe she can't because she's not a panelist. I don't know if Josh can do that. I might have just tried to push Zoom too far.
Hey Joe, I've managed to. I've just made Vivian an honorary panelist. So Vivian,
excellent.
If you want to answer that question, I think you should be able to now.
I can. That's all quite scary. Hello.
Sorry to put you on the spot like that. Hello, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So looking a bit scruffy this evening. One of my PhD students was originally planning on doing an eye tracking study in the lab, and then COVID hit. And part of what her original eye tracking study was to do it's with Welsh English bilinguals. So we were looking at an elicited imitation task because we had specific linguistic features we were looking at. And so what we decided to do when the pandemic hit was to split her study into two separate experiments. And so we ran all the comprehension and production stuff that wasn't eye tracking on Gorilla. And she got a Gorilla grant as part of that, actually, which was great. And yeah, it went really, really well. We did the backup thing with Zoom just to be on the safe side because we were recording production data, and we set it up as a, you know, they heard the sound and then they just had to record themselves. Now, the issue we had was the defaults, and this was the first ever experiment we'd done on Gorilla, so we really didn't have much of a clue what we were doing, right? And the support team were fantastic and were really helpful. And the default of the web, you know, the format that it was initially sending the sound files in, we couldn't open it and we couldn't get it to run. So then the support team told us how to change that to, I think it was an MP3 format, and it worked fine. And the only time-consuming thing is transcribing the data. So it worked really well, and we got it actually worked out very nicely because we're in Swansea, and finding Welsh English bilinguals that are fluent in both is trickier than in North Wales. So we actually got quite a few participants from North Wales as well, so we can see the dialect difference between the two types.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So it was all fun. It was great. And yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Vivian. That was wonderful. Thank you for jumping in with like no notice. That was tremendously brave. If everybody wants to give their appreciation for Vivian for jumping into a call like that and just saying, what should we say? We'll just say like brave. Go with brave. If you think that was amazing, you wouldn't have wanted to do that, but you really appreciate that she did it. Thank you. There's one more question from Julio about more controlled type of randomization. So I've been giving this a little bit of thought. The way because I want to go back and get final tips from the audience. I'm just going to do this quickly. The way I'd appreciate that is on my spreadsheet, I'd create two separate types of stimuli. So maybe 4 different types here and 4 different types here. And I do them in blocks of these 4, blocks of these 4, blocks of these 4, blocks of these 4. And that would make sure that one from here and one from this block here are never straight one after the other, because they're always interleaved by another block over here. Does that make sense? So there are lots of really clever things you can do with the spreadsheet if you think it, and just randomizing it in different blocks so that they shuffle within themselves rather than across the whole list, to stop stimuli trials being sequentially, identical trials being sequentially one after the other. If you go to our spreadsheet walkthrough guide, the very last example shows you an example of that, and just build on the same principles. I think you'll probably be with it now. So that's the end of the Q&A session. We're now going to go back to our panelists for their final wishes. Let's do it in the reverse order. So let's start with Kim. Kim, what would you like to see in the future for online speech and auditory research? What research would you like to see? What new tools would you like to see?
Well, a very small thing that I've been wishing for is to be able to see what trial a participant is at within a task, especially for our setup where we are sort of a monitored session. Sometimes when they take a little bit longer than expected, you know, I'm kind of wondering, okay, did they take a break and they've walked away and I can see they're stuck on a trial for a while, or, you know, it gives me a sense of whether or not I should interrupt them. So that would be really helpful. I think
that is a neat idea, because we have that panel where you can see they've started the task, haven't yet finished it. But if you could just see the trial number, particularly when you're doing that Zoom thing, seeing that counting up, just awesome.
I don't have to obsessively refresh and hope that they've moved on. So that would be helpful.
Cool, fantastic, thank you. Who's next? Kyle, I think.
I think it's me. I guess let's see, wish list. Well, going back to the video, so, you know, for people for whom it's important to synchronize auditory and visual stimuli, one tricky thing that I found, so not using videos in Gorilla, but just videos on the web in general, is the way codecs work and the way like MP4 packages, you know, work, and how different audio codecs and video codecs interact, and all these different combinations can really be a headache sometimes. So I guess I'd like to know just what the gold standard is. So like, what is the video format with the best quality audio that you could use? So in terms of if you're just playing sounds, I think that it's called FLAC, FLAC, is, you know, a lossless encoding. That's the best for audio. But I don't actually know what the gold standard would be for video plus audio.
Yeah. Me neither. And I think part of it is a war between the different browsers, because of course Chrome supports its own formats the best, the Google format's the best, Edge supports the Microsoft formats best, and Safari supports the Apple formats best. So that's part of the trickiness here. I will take that back to my tech team so that see if they can find out what is best, if there's a better answer to your question. Alice.
Yeah, I'm trying to think now. I forgot to think about this. There are various things though that we've struggled with, and we have actually found there is the functionality to do them using the scripting and using the hooks. So really getting our heads around that made a big difference. Maybe some way of alerting you more if someone is having sound drop out. You sort of have to, because often, as I said, you don't see that you see the sounds haven't played for some reason on the spreadsheet, you know, they're like as a blank box, but actually alerting you to that might be useful. And I had another point that I've forgotten, but yeah.
Just what would an alert look like? Not a real-time alert. Do you mean an alert in the spreadsheet?
Yeah, you know, so yeah, an alert in the spreadsheet, maybe somewhere at the top it just says, you know, note sound dropout, or even like a, you know, like a little exclamation symbol next to them on the participant. I don't know if that would need too much real-time analysis, but yeah, something to alert you to the fact that they would have had an issue.
Yeah. I don't know how we would do that without looking at the data in detail. And I think we're nervous of looking at your data because it is, in fact, your data. But yes, good. That's a good one. And finally, Rachel.
So my wish list for Gorilla specifically would, and maybe this might be in the works with the game tasks that are coming. I'd love a way to help promote engagement in web-based auditory research, particularly for those of us who are more towards the behavioral psychophysics side of things or look at adaptation. Two kind of areas of research that kind of fundamentally require longer exposure, more trials, which in an online format is one of those things that are kind of at odds, where you're really trying, when we port our studies online, to make them faster, shorter, to promote engagement. So some way to maybe gamify routine, you know, if they're making 600, you know, 2 alternative forced choice decisions, some way to do that. Lori Holt at Carnegie Mellon has done this very successfully. I put in a press briefing there. And if there were some way that those types of tools were available to people who couldn't, who like me, who don't have the skill set or resources to start from the ground up and make a video game, I think it could really revolutionize to some degree the types of questions that could be asked online.
Well, do I have a present coming your way soon, Rachel? Because that is exactly
If you need beta testers, our lab would be very keen to help.
Delighted. We'll definitely reach out when it's ready. That's what my PhD student, that's exactly what he's doing. We've got this the game builder, the Gorilla game builder. It's going to be draggy and droppy with particle effects and colors. We've worked with researchers who he was getting 8-year-olds to do 8 weeks of training on a go no go task every single day for 10-15 minutes every single day, and we dressed that up as like 16 different games with a story and a whole load of stuff. So like, I mean, that was one where we were hired to do the work. It's probably got slightly higher production values, but the plan is to give researchers the ability to create little simple games that are engaging and just more fun without having to become software developers and computer scientists, which, you know, we're already behavioral scientists. One science, please, one science, even though very, very good at coding, because we all have to do all of the data analysis, and we're all super smart, right? And it's fun, frankly. But yes, the game editor is going to be the tool for you. Like I said, my PhD student is looking at using video games for particularly language tasks, but we'll get involved. We'll reach out to you when it's ready to have a play and get your feedback on what else you need. And for everybody else who's listening, keep an eye out for that, which should be talking about the game builder in more detail at the Be Online conference. Josh is going to share the link to Be Online again with you. So if you want to make sure you're updated about the Be Online register, and as and when we've got more information about our panelists and speakers or inviting people to come and speak, then you'll get notified and you'll be on all the right mailing lists. Brilliant. So thank you for joining us for our second Gorilla Presents webinar. Each month we'll be addressing a different topic in online behavioral research. So why not write in the chat with any suggestions, or get in touch with us via Twitter or Facebook to let us know what you'd like us to cover next. There will be a survey afterwards. I think when the session ends, then an email gets sent out with a survey, which helps us make these sessions more useful. We're putting these together to help the research community. So feedback from you guys of what's useful, what works, what doesn't work is really valuable to us and really valuable to the whole research community. So please fill it out. The next webinar, I believe, is going to be about mouse tracking and eye tracking experiments online. So if that's your jam, please look out for that one. And with that, thank you and good night. I'm going to end this pretty abruptly. I know you all drop out, but hopefully see you all another time. Thank you. You've been an absolutely fantastic panel, an absolutely fantastic audience. I've loved the engagement and all of your questions. So with that, thank you. Good night.